All right, today we're going to be talking about the causes of World War II, in particular, the immediate build-up to the actual war itself, which is mostly to do with the relation between the Soviet Union, Germany, the British, and the Poles themselves. Uh, Here is the learning standard that we'll be addressing today. We are going to determine multiple and complex causes and effects of historical events within world history, particularly World War II in this case. Now, we're going to open with what was Germany thinking? What was their perspective on this whole Danzig situation, which was a region in Poland that was predominantly German. They spoke German, they were German, but after the Treaty of Versailles, they were basically put in Polish territory, and they operate as a semi-independent city-state. But Hitler, obviously, with his dreams of uniting the German people, wanted to have control over this city, which the Poles called Gdynia, and this location was a hot point of contention for both the German and Polish governments, with both sides wanting to keep control of this land because it was one of the only ports that the Poles had access to. This functionally, Hitler saw this as a matter of his pride, his people's pride, his nation's pride, and if he wasn't able to get control of this land, obviously he would want to go to war in order to secure it. Now, Poland would completely throughout this entire period of the interwar period, as Hitler seized power and took control of other countries and territories, they staunchly refused to negotiate over the Polish corridor, which included Danzig, and as such, this would lead to escalating tensions in the world, particularly Europe. Now, it's important to talk about Britain and their relationship with Germany because initially the British policy was appeasement, which means they basically sought to avoid any conflict they could with Germany, and it was mostly successful, obviously, because the war didn't start till 1939, this appeasement policy was under Neville Chamberlain, their prime minister at the time. He was very staunchly anti-war and wanted to do anything that he could to avoid it, which meant ceding other countries to Hitler and allowing him to rearm, functionally. But ultimately, due to mounting pressure from inside his government, he guaranteed Polish independence in March of 1939, as Hitler was beginning to press more thoroughly for Danzig. So this would escalate tensions between the two countries. Now, the general public in Britain was in roughly two camps, with roughly 50-50 split, with some people preferring to go to war again for the Poles and to stop Hitler, and others advocating to stay out of it, none of their business, let's just keep peace, don't worry about it. Now, this Polish guarantee is ultimately the crux by which World War II would start, because Britain and France, an ally of Britain, guaranteed the independence of the Polish state, meaning that if Hitler were to declare war on it and take it into his own territory, they would go to war in defense of their ally here. Now, this was intended to deter the Germans from ever even considering going to war with Poland, but this actually had the opposite effect. Hitler saw this as a slight against him and basically he still didn't give up on Poland. He wanted Poland. It was enough that he was willing to risk war with the British and French. It was functionally a moral obligation for the British to secure the independence of the Poles, even though the Polish state itself was very unstable, lots of random domestic revolts, and even aggressor behavior against the Soviet Union earlier, 10 years ago. Ultimately, this would force the British and the French into war with Germany when Germany declared war on Poland later this year. Now, in general, the public, again, they were divided on the issue of this war. Having lived, most of them, through the devastation that was World War I, many were hesitant to chuck their nation back into the fire of war against Germany again. But with this guarantee, the public's opinion generally shifted over to a more positive view of going to war with Germany due to the perceived moral obligation they had to protect Poland from German aggression. Of course, ultimately, the British miscalculated this play because they actually didn't want war, right? They just wanted to prevent Germany from expanding. Now, they underestimated Germany's resolve in this case and their military capabilities. They thought that because Hitler's rearmament was very recent, they thought he wouldn't be ready for war. He'd have to wait another year or so before they'd even be close to ready to do war. So this was seen as a way to delay the war. Now, of course, Chamberlain himself wanted to keep on the appeasement train and just let the Germans take the Polish corridor, Of course, this didn't end up happening. The British public was largely unprepared for the realities of another war, but again, they would be forced into it by Hitler's invasion. Now, in the coming months to the war, the British and French actually sent diplomats to Moscow to try and negotiate with Stalin about this Polish issue, trying to secure him firmly as an anti-Hitler ally. But they weren't willing to concede any of the Finnish territories or the Baltic states, so they were ultimately unsuccessful in negotiating anything, which left Hitler with the ability to send his own negotiator, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and he was able to negotiate spheres of influence within the Baltic states in Eastern Europe that would divide them between the Russians and the Germans, ultimately basically saying that these two states would not go to war with each other and would basically divide Poland between the two states when Hitler invaded it eventually. Now, this pact would allow Germany to invade Poland without any fear of Soviet intervention, which would be their main problem, because the border with France was well enough fortified that they weren't actually too concerned about the French counter-invading them if the French declared war on them. So Hitler basically saw this as free reign in Poland. He can take it out. He has no worries from the east, which would be an issue because of the large front and supply that would eventually happen there. And this basically shocked the whole world. No one expected this coming, because fascism and communism are functionally diametrically opposed ideologies, and they aren't really compatible with each other, but Hitler and Stalin were practical enough that they were able to put these ideological differences aside, that they could take Polish land and basically establish themselves as just competing spheres of influence, not necessarily hard enemies. And of course, on the very eve of war, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Josef Beck met in order to try and negotiate the return of the Polish quarter, including Danzig, to the Germans. The Germans were prepared to take a few concessions on the issue in order to keep the peace and just secure the German peoples in Poland, their safety, because at the time, the Polish government was not doing enough to protect the ethnic minority of Germans in the city of Danzig. So basically, Poles were able to discriminate freely against the Germans in that state, and it was just not a great situation. Hitler saw this as, a slight against the German people, and due to his ideology, he would be forced to take more severe actions against the state. Now, Beck, with his government as well, were unable to actually negotiate the Danzig or Polish quarter because they thought Poland, having seen some success in independence wars in the interwar period, they thought they would be able to stand against Germany, especially with Allied assistance. But ultimately, internal pressure from the government that was just staunchly they need to stay independent was why that this negotiation failed, and the Germans and Poles would be set on the course of war with each other, ultimately sparking the actual Second World War. Let's see. So Poland, this is what Poland was thinking, right? They found themselves caught between the Soviets and the Germans, both extremely powerful states, easily able to take their land from them at basically whim. They were determined, no matter what they could do, they were doing everything in their power to maintain their sovereignty, so they would be seeking alliances with the French and British primarily in order to secure sort of a way for them to avoid the Germans or Soviets randomly going in on them and taking their land. But Beck's refusal to negotiate with Germany here ultimately would lead to the partitioning of Poland between this German and Soviet spheres, and ultimately Hitler here saw this as an easy war. He wanted a quick victory. He didn't want to prolong conflict, because the longer it dragged on, similar to kind of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the longer it drags on, the more international attention is going to be brought to the war he's going to be waging, and the longer it goes on, the worse and worse it looks for him and Germany, and he doesn't want that, right? So Hitler and his ideas for tactics and strategy basically revolved around blitzkrieg, which was basically overwhelm the enemy forces with speed, armor, and just keep pushing. This was able to work because of the German industrial advantage they had over Poland, as well as they were a little bit more prepared for war than the Polish were. They had technological advances, they had more men in the army, and ultimately they were able to hold on to this belief that the British and French, due to the appeasement that they had been giving him, so he took Czechoslovakia, he took Austria, etc., they thought that the British and French would ultimately just cave on the issue, letting Germany invade Poland with no actual response. The Poles, in response to these mounting pressures from the Germans, to take the Polish corridor from them, they began to mobilize their forces in response to this German threat, and ultimately, basically, the actual outside of the war, the Germans staged a raid on a a radio tower in Danzig, and Germans were attacked there and they were killed, which was the German pretext to go to war in defense of their people that were living in Danzig. So then this sparked the actual full invasion of the Poles. So Hitler and his armies marched through Poland, and the Polish, they fought as well as they could in the situation, but ultimately the Blitzkrieg was enough to overwhelm Polish defenses, so they collapsed. So yeah. And in the aftermath of this invasion, they were overrun, right? They were divided between the Soviets and the Germans within like a couple months, and this would be the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. Now, this war, disastrous consequences all around, many people dying and whatnot. So this basically whole like 2-month stretch of time where the Poles and Germans and the Soviets were all trying to figure out the spheres of influence there. Due to the breakdown between them, there was just no way they could ever possibly hope to achieve peace unless the Poles were willing to cede some of their territory, and then Hitler says he was not going to invade, but you can't really trust his word on it given his prior actions to the contrary. Now, the sources are on the screen right now. Thank you for listening. There is a short formative I would like you to take. There's going to be a question. You just have to answer it nice and quick, just to make sure you understand what happened in the lead up to World War II. Thanks again.